let's take a trip down memory lane and talk about some of the most important and groundbreaking albums that pretty much single-handedly launched entire genres to this day. Whether it be for influencing many subgenres, just one genre, these are the albums that set the framework, that laid the fucking foundation for hundreds of bands to come after them, spawning entire movements and redefining what heavy metal can be, pushing the envelope, pushing the limits, pushing the boundaries, and always going out into new frontiers of adventure when it comes to how they constructed music. Now, one thing I will say is if you think that there's an album that predates one of the ones that I talk about in this video, that is fine. There's a lot of hindsight to claiming that an album started a genre because a lot of times terminology comes around sometimes decades later that gets attributed revisionarily to other albums and other bands that existed and made that type of music before the terms even existed to begin with. So I'm not saying that there aren't albums that could predate these that would have some of the qualities of the genres that they helped. I am simply saying that these are the albums that catapulted a genre into the forefront and inspired tons of bands that would come after them. But before we get into it, be sure to drop a like if you end up enjoying this video, and down in the comment section below, let me know what your favorite genre-starting album or genre-defining album you enjoy the most. I can't wait to hear it. But let's get this list started off with the heavy hitter that is Black Sabbath's 1970 self-titled album, which literally left such an impact on so many heavy metal genres. Like, I feel like it would be a fucking Bible list. Like, you're going grocery shopping with how many records this one inspired, but predominantly, doom metal and heavy metal were massively influenced and inspired by Black Sabbath's debut album. This predated some of the most extreme genres that metal would have to offer, and sitting shoulder to shoulder with the blues-inspired, rock and roll-inspired Led Zeppelins and Deep Purples, as well as the psychedelic and progressive metal and rock bands that would come contemporarily, Black Sabbath just stuck out like a sore thumb for their macabre exterior, the way they approached lyricism, the haunting and ominous instrumentation, the way that they approach songwriting and constructing riff writing. It still stands the test of time for heaviness, and there are some records nowadays that are so fucking heavy, but do not hold a candle and pale in comparison to the atmosphere that this record builds, and it's very easy to see why so many people think that this is the crown jewel and defining moment for heavy metal's existence and doom metal's existence. But that's not to sell short the inspiration that it gave to so many other genres and bands and albums thereafter. Black Sabbath really were the kings, and I don't care what anyone says, Aussie Black Sabbath is the best Black Sabbath. Fucking fight me. Kicking it to 1988, we have Carcass with Reek of Putrefaction, which just birthed Goregrind. This is one of those records that you can't really dispute as birthing a genre. Usually metalheads just love arguing if the chicken or the egg came first, but with different albums, and they just compare them consistently. Like, there are still debates going on of who invented black metal and death metal, but with Goregrind, you really can't say that Carcass didn't spawn Goregrind. It birthed it out of the fifth dimension of vile putridity, pun unintended, grotesque and gruesome instrumentation. They took all of the fast tempo and tenacity of grindcore, which was pretty contemporary at the time. Like, I feel like Goregrind is pretty interesting and intriguing because it came around when grindcore was still in its early infancy as well. And it's rare to see an offshoot of a genre happen while the original genre is still kind of just being developed. And you know what's funny is like Carcass were really instrumental and important to mellow death as well later on, because I guess they just got fucking bored and wanted to like redefine another genre. The fact these like insane crazy Brits could just birth Goregrind and then proceed to like dominate melodic death metal, it's a testament to how freakish they are. But Goregrind's medical pathology and gory imagery, obsession with medical terminology, the really slurpy watery vocals. I would say that Carcass laid a lot of the groundwork for Goregrind, but they still had a lot of death metal and grind influence, so a lot of the idiosyncrasies that Goregrind would later embody I don't think were fully realized quite yet on Carcass's album. But you can say that about a lot of records that start a genre, like you have to have the template and the starting point, and other bands can perfect that. So Carcass released 2 Goregrind albums, and then they fell off the map, and then came back with their melodic death metal era, and that's pretty much been where they have been since, but it is kind of cool to look back and see how gore grind started. Now, I hate to disappoint like any grind fans, I'm gonna be for real, I didn't include grindcore on this list because I feel like that would start a complete war in the comments section. Considering just how much crust punk and specifically hardcore punk overlapped with early grindcore, trying to define what album was like the moment that was grindcore, it's kind of difficult. I guess you could kind of say Napalm Death, but I ain't gonna fight that battle. Next up, 1987, we have Death's album Scream Bloody Gore, which I consider to be the first death metal album. Now, I will say that Seven Churches by Possessed is a really good contender, but I think that Possessed, the difference between them and Death is Possessed took a lot more influence from speed metal and sort of that Motorhead worship that death metal did have in its early years. Like most of the early death metal bands, the Obituaries, the Autopsies, the Morbid Angels, the Deaths, the Possessed, they did have a lot of that thrash metal influence, and I think that the early works of Possessed do feel a little bit more thrash metal inspired than Death, whereas I think Death really had the energy, they had the fury, they had the texture and dimensional depth to their music and just continue to redefine what death metal could be throughout their entire run. It's not hard to see why they inspired so many bands and so many genres, because they also inspired technical death metal, but that would come later down the line, and I would say that Death would probably be the crown jewel of technical death metal as well. But Scream Bloody Gore was such an awesome time in metal because Death started to become kind of a household name for extreme metal, and for something so extreme and so like genre defining, that is really cool to look back on. I'm having to look at the name of this one because I've been trying to like pronounce this all day and I fucking suck at French, but Alsace's 2007 record Souvenir d'Entre Monde. I probably fucked that up and butchered that. But yeah, this was the first time, in my opinion, that black gaze really hit the map and completely just changed how black metal was seen, caused a culture war in terms of black metal, of people being like, well, it's not really black metal, you're not true cult. And it's interesting to see in 2007 how Alcé was sort of making an entire genre without intending to do so. They just had a lot of post-metal and specifically shoegaze influence, and that combined with black metal. And it wasn't until the mid-2010s, I would say, when you started to see like Sunbather from Death Heaven, that black gaze started to really get pushed into the forefront. But black gaze predated that, and its roots with the atmospheric edge of shoegaze music being put into black metal, it extends far past the popularity that it would later get by publications and by reviewers, and just by being sort of the musical zeitgeist of metal and beyond for that time period, that little sliver of time, which honestly isn't that unusual for like a genre to catapult into success, but its roots and where it came from being far before that. And it's not like Alcest fell off the map or anything. They continued to make some great material. I'm not the biggest fan of them, but they still came out with like quite a bit of great black gaze music thereafter. A genre that is also kind of hard to pin down because it overlaps with something else is thrash metal. Who started thrash metal? In the grand scheme of things, you could just say Motorhead and leave it at that, because there wasn't a single thrash metal band or even a death metal band, some of early black metal bands, some of early grindcore bands, that were not inspired by Motorhead, but they're usually called speed metal and kind of fit the glove more for just classic heavy metal music. So who was the first to really plant that seed for thrash metal? Honestly, 1983 is where you have to start, because so many of the biggest names in thrash metal released their debuts that year. You had Metallica, you had Anthrax, you had Exodus, but in my opinion, the band that I think, from just observing other bands talking about their influence, including the contemporaries, I'm giving it to Show No Mercy by fucking Slayer. I mean, what can you say? Slayer really did redefine heaviness, and not just for thrash metal, but extreme metal as a whole. They touched so many different genres with their just onslaught of sound, the sheer heaviness and aggression and ferocity that they approached heavy metal music, not even just thrash metal music, just heavy metal as an outlet, is just insane. It was second to none at the time. And if you go back and listen to Slayer's early works compared to like Kill 'Em All by Metallica, it makes it look like child's play. And that's saying something, because Kill 'Em All by Metallica, very raw, very primordial, very primitive, very heavy. It's not like the other other bands weren't also very heavy and brutal, if you want to say it. It's just Slayer were at another level in how fast they played and how aggressive they played. And you can see it in so many different genres what Slayer did for the way that Slayer re-energized, reinvigorated, and redefined how you approached heaviness from a metal perspective. When it comes to metalcore, you're probably going to think of bands like Converge, maybe Botch, maybe Integrity, but hardcore punk overlapped a lot with early metalcore. But there is a band that I have consistently sung the praises of that is one of the first metalcore bands, if not the first metalcore bands, that don't usually get that much attention but have been massively prolific. I'm talking about Ringworm, and specifically their 1991 demo. It is very packed tight, it's claustrophobic, it's very short, it clings to that brevity, but what are you gonna expect? It's a demo. But Ringworm, I just want to shout out the praises of, because while a lot of metalcore sort of peaked in the 1990s, late 1990s, going into the 2000s, especially when you had bands like Killswitch Engage and As I Lay Dying being a part of like the new wave of American heavy metal, it kind of is easy to see why those bands get the praise. But Ringworm have just tirelessly been releasing so many records that are fantastic, and they're one of those revisionary bands that like they got called metalcore later in their career once the term was found out and people were like, wait, these guys were literally doing this before like anyone else was, pretty much. At the time, they were just seen as like a hardcore punk band, and you could call them that. They're kind of a hardcore band in the same way that like Knocked Loose is, and that may be a weird comparison, but you gotta understand, it's 1991, so the loudness of a band like Knocked Loose, it didn't really exist. And even if they cling more towards the hardcore punk edge of things, I really think that Ringworm is a defining moment in metalcore and a band that deserves more praise than they get for how much influence that they had. And that's kind of how it goes a lot, like an underground band having a lot of influence on the bands that end up setting the stage for the popularity of a genre, which I think is kind of sad, but I guess the influence is its own right and its own prize. In 1984, we had Bathory release their self-titled album, which is, in my opinion, the first black metal album. Even though Venom named it, and even though a lot of people think that like Venom, Celtic Frost, King Diamond were very instrumental in starting black metal, they absolutely were. The shrillness and the bone-shredding rawness of Bathory's self-titled album is just everything you would come to expect from all of the Norwegian black metal projects. There are bands in 2024 that are trying to replicate the heaviness and rawness of Bathory. They were lo-fi before lo-fi was cool, and if you compare it to even the production of other contemporary early black metal releases, it's not hard to see why they are usually the one that wins the argument for who started it. And similarly to how I don't think Possessed started death metal, I don't think that Venom started black metal, simply because I think that they took more influence from thrash metal, from speed metal. Bathory just embodied all of the evil, all of the dark incantation, all of the black magic. And if I heard a raw black metal album come out in 2024 that was to the same degree of excellency and sort of immaturity almost of that debut Bathory album, I would think it's phenomenal. And I think that timelessness and that classic sort of veneer and the influence that Bathory had, both from a production standpoint, a riff writing standpoint, I think is pretty much second to none in the black metal world. Nu metal dominated the late 1990s going into the 2000s, and it was the biggest metal genre potentially of all time. In terms of the numbers that bands like Slipknot and System of a Down, Linkin Park did, as well as bands like Limp Bizkit and Mudvayne, the list goes on and on. There are so many massive nu metal bands that in our lexicon, it has just become a part of our vocabulary. These are household names. Non-metalheads would know these bands, but where did it start, in my opinion? You gotta talk about Korn's self-titled album from 1994, which that wasn't all it inspired. It also inspired a lot of alternative metal, and considering that nu metal became pretty homogenous throughout the 2000s with a very clear-cut pattern and formula that bands would pander to, it's kind of cool that Korn was very unique from the time that they burst on the scene just throughout their entire career. Jonathan Davis was literally like no one else. It was unparalleled. There's no one that just sounds like Jonathan Davis. But the weird, quirky instrumentation, the weird vocal deliveries, the rap moments, the heavy alternative instrumentation, the gritty sort of texture, the way that things were produced, sort of crossover mainstream appeal while still being extremely heavy, having that rock semblance and taking a lot of the grungy ideas of the 1990s. Yeah, I think you have to give it to Korn for starting nu metal, in my opinion. And they may have not been the biggest, but they're one of the biggest, and they might not have made the best nu metal album ever. That's pretty debatable. I think in my opinion you'd have to go with Iowa by Slipknot or Hybrid Theory from Linkin Park, but that's just my opinion. Korn started, in my opinion. Let's go to another subgenre, an offshoot. We're talking about symphonic black metal, and it was pretty much kickstarted by the 1994 album by Emperor, In the Nightside Eclipse. And I think there are other bands that really meant a lot. I think Summoning's another band that is a good influence and inspiration point for a lot of bands. The Emperor showed that you do not have to be only heavy. You can have depth and you can have texture to your instrumentation in a similar way to how melodic death metal redefined the brutality war of death metal at the time. You don't have to always be raw. And the sheer atmosphere that Emperor was able to build on In the Nightside Eclipse was incredible. It was pretty unheard of. Black metal by that time had a pretty clear formula that a lot of bands abided by, specifically in like the Norwegian scene. It was hard to find bands that were really pushing the envelope of what black metal could be or taking any influence in. And notoriously, black metal has always sort of gatekept other influences. They haven't really wanted to see anything else in the genre besides what they like. But Emperor showed that you don't have to compromise any of that to make a kick-ass record with different influences. Let's talk about the debut album by Melvins. From 1987, we have Gluey, and this was instrumental for the development of two different genres, sludge metal and grunge. And I know grunge is like an adjacent metal genre, not a metal genre, but it's worth talking about. Melvins really did redefine how distortion and feedback, fuzziness was utilized in metal music. Up until that point, there were some experimental artists that had a lot of noise in their instrumentation, but when you look at a lot of the other big metal genres and subgenres at that time, the death metals, the black metals, the grindcores, you didn't really see distortion and noise and feedback and fuzz in the same way that you would on Melvin's album. From the get-go, their stoner aesthetic was a big influence on stoner metal, stoner rock, sludge metal, grunge music, and so many bands that would come after them took so much influence from how they packed that into their instrumentation to feel crushing and just asphyxiating, sapping the complete life out of a composition and just leaving it in this desolate place of noisiness and this auditorial onslaught that made it feel like you were trapped in a desert just begging for an oasis. Melvin's attitude and their punk exterior mixed with everything, and it really did set the stage for so many sludge bands, so many stoner bands, grunge bands, and honestly the Melvins had so much influence and importance on all genres of metal considering how they approach their songwriting. And whether it's an extreme metal genre like death metal or black metal or whatever it may be, Melvins did have a hand in crafting all of those genres, and they've been so prolific and they're always experimenting, and I'll never miss a Melvins album. What are your guys' opinions of this list? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And what other genres would you like to talk about? I would love to hear it down in the comment section below. I just had 10 for you guys. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.